Hi everyone. So a viewer was asking me recently, why is it the case that INFJs tend to be seen as intellectuals by other people? I like this question because embedded within it are other questions that I have been asked recently, including things like, why is it the case, or what happens if an INFJ shuts down their introverted intuition and I completely, and as well as where does it come from, the experience that INFJs describe sometimes, that they just know things, just knowing, right? I've discussed some of these issues before, but they deserve a refresher. So again, we're talking about why they're perceived as intellectuals. I think that will have something to do also with shutting down NI, and it will have something to do with the phenomenon of just knowing. So number one, you need to distinguish between two contexts in which an INFJ might be told that they are an intellectual. They might be told that because they're often in their own heads, or they might be told that because they're all about the intellect. And there's a big difference between the mind and the intellect. The way that you could put this is that the intellect is only a part of the mind. The intellect is not the imagination, the intellect is not fantasy, the intellect is not metaphor. The intellect is only partly creativity, and so forth. So it's true that some INFJs come across as intellectual in the first sense. Perhaps all INFJs come across as intellectual in the first sense of being in their heads, because they're in their heads. Only some INFJs come across as intellectual in the second sense. Now, these latter INFJs are very often just compliant INFJs. They are adaptive INFJs. Remember that an adaptive INFJ is an INFJ that tends to repress their nature, you might put it like that, their introverted intuition being their primary mode of modulating, regulating the world experience. And they do that in the name of adaptation, in the name of belonging, in the name of being accepted. Fundamentally behind this is a fear of external reality. So there's an insistence on exerting control, and whenever there's something that you should always keep in mind. Whenever we're talking about control, an impulse to control, a drive to control, an instinctive need to control, very often not very conscious, but nevertheless observable in behavior if you're carefully paying attention. Control is related primarily to the judging functions. It's primarily related to the JE functions, the functions of extroverted judgment, FE and TE, controlling the environment or controlling the social environment. But it's also related to the functions of introverted judgments, FI and TI, which are more about controlling, internal checking. Consider a function like TI, because I think it's obvious enough that FE and TE are about control, at least in part, but because it's about managing external resources, again, sometimes more impersonally, like in the TE fashion, sometimes more personally, interpersonally, like the FE fashion. But there's an element of control there in a very obvious way that's easy to see. It might be less easy to understand that TI and FI are also about control. They're about internal control. TI is all about consistency. TI is all about rationality. TI is all about coherence between strings of thoughts, between propositions, between ideas. It will just check. It's like it will apply some sort of in one instance, let's say, a logical framework to make sure to check that everything is actually sort of fitting together. That's not something that NI does. NI is much more associative. It's not what SE does. It's not what FE does insofar as what FE does is much more doing this externally through intersubjective interactions. But there is a way of being controlling internally via TI, and there's a way of being controlling externally via FE. If you're too controlling, well, that's going to have the effect of a lack of creativity, of a lack of imagination. Maybe not a lack, an inhibition, a restraint, a constriction. And that's what happens when there is too much TI dominating the rest, when there is too much FE as well. When you don't let your irrational functions, as Jung calls them, the functions of perception, when you allow these functions to be completely enslaved or dominated by the functions of judgments. The functions of judgments are very important in the process of actually coming to certain conclusions, in the process of making decisions, in the process of taking up certain patterns of action. But creativity, imagination, fantasy activity, that has a lot to do with your functions of introverted perception and an extroverted perception. So an INFJ who's seen as intellectual by people who are just like so in the world that they find it intellectual to be in your own mind a lot of the time. I wouldn't worry too much about these INFJs. I think that's just a function of just being like an IN type, probably, it's a normal. INFJs that are described as intellectual in the other sense of being cool, collected, very irrational, very logical, and kind of, anal retentive, to use a Freudian term. Well, in the case of these INFJs, I think that what we have is adaptation and compliance, not through, there is a repression of NI. There's not so much an overvaluation and over projection of the FE function in this case, but of the TI function. More introverted INFJs that are nevertheless compliant might take this route, and they are not in this case, again, keep this in mind, they are not withdrawing. FE and TI work together. It's always an FE-TI axis, just as there is an NI-SE axis. So these INFJs are not socially withdrawing, they're not withdrawn, but they often adapt in their own minds through the controlling abilities that TI provides them with, and that tends to dry up the resources of intuition. It tends to dry up the creativity and the imagination that are the core of the meaning-making pursuits of INFJ in life, of what makes life worth living for INFJs, what fills an INFJ with motivation and purpose. So if you're told that you're overly intellectual in the second sense, I'll put it harshly, you're living inauthentically, even though you might think that you're not giving into the pressures of others in the sense of peer pressure. You're not being like an introjective FE type of inauthentic INFJ, but you're still being inauthentic because you're still repressing NI. Except in this case, you're doing it through TI. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this, guys. And give me a like if you enjoyed this video. Don't forget that if you want to explore more about the INFJ personality, I've written books about the INFJ personality, including my latest one, The Infinite Soul, on INFJ life in a modern world, exploring some of these issues in great depth. It's all about how you can be an authentic INFJ, really valuing NI, your other functions, so remaining who you are, but finding purpose, value, and meaning in your life as an INFJ. This is the book to get, and it's prequel, The Ecstatic Soul, which looks in depth at the INFJ mind, what's it like to have an INFJ mind, what's it like to think and be an INFJ. Get this book if you want to know more. The links are below, and what is below as well is a link to my Patreon page. Guys, I depend on your kind donations for support to my channel. It's thanks to you I keep going. You get access to bonus content there on Patreon, community, access to me. So please consider it. That link is below, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.